For over 50 years, Eric Clapton has carried a secret that has haunted him every single day. He betrayed his best friend in the worst way possible. He fell in love with George Harrison's wife and wrote one of the greatest love songs in rock history about her. He destroyed a friendship that meant everything to him. He caused pain that he can never undo. For decades, Eric has stayed mostly quiet about what really happened between him and George Harrison. The guilt, the love, the forgiveness that seemed impossible. Now at 80 years old, Eric Clapton is finally ready to break his silence and tell the whole truth about George Harrison. What he reveals about their friendship and his ultimate betrayal will shock you. The confession he makes will break your heart. Keep watching because what Eric says changes everything. Before we dive into video, please subscribe our channel. The beginning, when two guitar gods became brothers. In 1964, Eric Clapton was a 19-year-old guitar player in a British blues band called the Yardbirds. He was talented but unknown. The Beatles were already conquering the world. Eric admired them from a distance, especially George Harrison, who was only 2 years older but seemed like a master guitarist. In a 2007 interview with Rolling Stone magazine, Eric recalled watching the Beatles on television and thinking George had something special. A quietness, a spiritual quality that came through in his playing. They first met in late 1964 at a London club. George approached Eric after a show and told him he loved his guitar playing. Eric was stunned. George Harrison from the Beatles was complimenting him. They talked for hours about music and guitars and the blues. In Eric's 2007 autobiography, he wrote that meeting George felt like meeting a long-lost brother. They understood each other instantly. By 1965, they were close friends. George would visit Eric's flat in London. They would sit and play guitars together for hours. No pressure, no audience, just two young men who loved music. Eric said in a 2015 interview with Uncut magazine that George was the first real friend he ever had. Eric's childhood had been difficult. He was raised by his grandmother believing she was his mother. When he discovered the truth, he felt abandoned and angry. George gave Eric something he desperately needed: acceptance, brotherhood, love. George invited Eric to Beatles recording sessions. Eric watched in awe as George worked on songs like If I Needed Someone and Taxman. George asked for Eric's opinion on guitar tones and techniques. In the 2011 documentary, George Harrison Living in the Material World, Eric said George treated him as an equal even though the Beatles were the biggest band on earth, and Eric was still struggling to make a name. In 1968, George invited Eric to play lead guitar on a Beatles song called While My Guitar Gently Weeps. It was an incredible honor. Eric was nervous, but George encouraged him. The result was one of the most beautiful guitar solos in rock history. Eric said in a 2001 interview with Guitar World that playing on that song was one of the proudest moments of his career. It symbolized the depth of his friendship with George. They were not just friends. They were musical soulmates, or so Eric thought. What he did not know was that he was about to destroy everything. Pattiboyd, the woman who changed everything. In 1964, George Harrison married a beautiful model and actress named Patty Boyd. She had appeared in the Beatles film A Hard Day's Night, and George fell instantly in love. They married in 1966 and seemed like the perfect couple. Patty was sweet and kind. George was gentle and spiritual. In photos from that era, they looked blissfully happy. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. George became obsessed with Indian spirituality and meditation. He traveled to India frequently to study with gurus. Patty went with him at first but grew tired of the austere lifestyle. George was becoming more detached, more interested in enlightenment than in his marriage. Patty felt lonely and neglected. In her 2007 memoir Wonderful Tonight, Patty wrote that George was physically present but emotionally absent. She said she tried to talk to him about it, but George would tell her that earthly attachments were illusions. Enter Eric Clapton. By 1968, Eric was a regular visitor to George and Patty's home in Surrey, England. He would come over for dinner, stay late talking. Eric noticed Patty in a way he never had before. In his autobiography, Eric admitted that he tried to fight the attraction. Patty was his best friend's wife. It was forbidden. Wrong. But the more time he spent around her, the deeper he fell. Eric said in a 2013 interview with The Telegraph that Patty represented everything he wanted. Beauty, warmth, stability. She was kind to him. She laughed at his jokes. She made him feel seen in a way no one else did. And she was married to George. The guilt was crushing, but the desire was stronger. By 1970, Eric was madly in love with Patty Boyd. He could not hide it anymore. In a moment of reckless honesty, he confessed his feelings to George. Eric told George that he was in love with Patty and wanted to be with her. The confession happened at George's house with Patty in the next room. In a 1999 interview with Mojo magazine, Eric said George's reaction shocked him. George did not yell or punch him. George simply looked at him with sad eyes and said, "You can have her. I do not care." Eric did not know if George meant it or if George was testing him. But the words cut deep. George did not fight for his wife, did not defend his marriage. George's spiritual detachment had become so extreme that he seemed indifferent to losing the woman he once loved. Patty later said in her book that George's response devastated her. She felt like a possession being passed between two men, not a person with her own feelings. Layla, the song that exposed everything. In 1970, Eric Clapton formed a new band called Derek and the Dominoes. They went into the studio to record an album. Eric was heartbroken. Patty had not left George despite Eric's confession. She was confused, torn between two men. Eric poured all his pain and longing into the music. The result was Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs, one of the greatest rock albums ever made. The title track Layla became one of the most famous love songs in history. The lyrics were desperate and pleading, a man begging the woman he loves to be with him. Eric said in a 2004 interview with Classic Rock magazine that writing Layla was like bleeding onto the page. Every word was true, every note was pain. He was singing directly to Patty, begging her to leave George and choose him. When the song was released, George Harrison knew immediately it was about his wife. Everyone knew. The rock community was scandalized. Eric Clapton, the man George considered a brother, had betrayed him publicly. In the 2011 documentary, Patty Boyd said George listened to Layla once and never spoke about it again. He buried his feelings the way he always did. Eric later admitted that releasing Layla was cruel. In a 2015 interview, he said he should have kept the song private, but his pain and ego overrode his judgment. He wanted the world to know how he felt. He wanted Patty to hear it and realize the depth of his love. He wanted George to feel the loss. Looking back, Eric said it was one of the most selfish things he ever did. The affair between Eric and Patty continued secretly for years. They would meet when George was traveling. Patty felt guilty but also wanted. Eric made her feel special in a way George no longer did. George knew about the affair but refused to confront it. In Patty's memoir, she wrote that George told her she was free to do what she wanted. He was beyond jealousy, beyond attachment, beyond caring. That indifference pushed Patty further into Eric's arms. The breaking point and the marriage. By 1974, Patty Boyd had had enough. George's emotional distance and Eric's passionate pursuit pulled her in opposite directions. She loved George but could not reach him. She was drawn to Eric but felt enormous guilt. The situation was destroying her. In her book, she described having panic attacks and crying herself to sleep. She felt like she was being torn in half. George finally agreed to a divorce. In interviews, George said the marriage had run its course. He spoke about it with his typical spiritual detachment. No anger, no bitterness, just acceptance. But people close to George said he was devastated. He simply refused to show it. George's friend Tom Petty said in a 2007 interview that George built walls around his emotions. Losing Patty hurt him deeply, but he would never admit it. In 1979, Eric Clapton and Patty Boyd got married. It should have been a happy ending. Eric had won the woman he loved. But the reality was complicated. Eric struggled with alcoholism and drug addiction. He was jealous and controlling. He expected Patty to fix him, to make him whole. The pressure was unbearable. Patty later said the marriage was difficult from the start. Eric was not the romantic hero from Layla. He was a broken man with demons he could not control. Meanwhile, George watched from a distance. He and Eric had barely spoken since the divorce. The friendship that once meant everything was shattered. In a 1987 interview, George said he forgave Eric and Patty, but he did not forget. He said betrayal changes relationships forever. Even with forgiveness, the trust is gone. Eric's marriage to Patty lasted only a few years. They divorced in 1989. By then, Eric had descended into severe addiction. He hit rock bottom, lost everything. In his darkest moments, he thought about George, about the friendship he destroyed, about the guilt that consumed him. Eric said in a 2007 interview that losing George hurt more than losing Patty. Patty was a romantic love. George was his brother, and Eric had betrayed him for a woman he could not even keep. The reconciliation that saved them both. In the late 1980s, something unexpected happened. George Harrison reached out to Eric Clapton. George called Eric out of the blue and asked how he was doing. Eric was shocked. After everything that happened, George still cared. In a 2001 interview, Eric said George's call saved his life. Eric was suicidal and alone. Hearing George's voice reminded him that redemption was possible. They met for lunch in London. It was awkward at first. They had not seen each other in years. But as they talked, the old connection returned. They laughed about old times, played guitars together. George told Eric that he had forgiven him years ago. He said holding onto anger was poison. He said Eric was still his brother. Nothing could change that. Eric broke down crying. In his autobiography, he wrote that George's forgiveness was the greatest gift anyone ever gave him. Over the next decade, they rebuilt their friendship. It was different than before, more cautious, but it was real. They collaborated on music. George appeared on Eric's albums. Eric played at George's concerts. In the 2011 documentary, Tom Petty said George and Eric had a bond that survived the worst betrayal imaginable. That kind of forgiveness is rare, almost holy. George never spoke publicly in detail about Eric and Patty. He kept his pain private, but people close to George said he genuinely let it go. George's spirituality was not just philosophy, he lived it. He practiced forgiveness and detachment. Eric said in a 2018 interview that George's ability to forgive taught him more about love than anything else in his life. George loved Eric enough to forgive the unforgivable. In the late 1990s, they were close again. Not like the innocent days of the 1960s, but close. Brothers who had been through war and come out the other side. Eric said in a 2013 interview that he treasured every moment with George during those years. He knew their time was limited. He knew he did not deserve George's friendship, but George gave it anyway. November 29, 2001, the day George died. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison died of cancer at age 58. Eric Clapton was with him near the end. In a 2004 interview with Larry King, Eric described visiting George in the hospital. George was weak but still had his sense of humor. They talked about music and old times. George told Eric he was ready to go. He was not afraid. He had made peace with everything, including the pain Eric caused him. Eric held George's hand and told him he loved him. He told George he was sorry for everything. George smiled and said there was nothing to forgive. They were brothers, always had been, always would be. Those were the last words George said to Eric. Then George closed his eyes and slipped away. Eric said he felt like part of his soul died with George that day. The grief was overwhelming. Eric had lost friends before, but losing George was different. George represented forgiveness, redemption, unconditional love. Without George, Eric felt unmoored. In a 2007 interview, Eric admitted he fell back into depression after George's death. He questioned everything: his music, his life, his worth as a person. Eric organized a tribute concert for George in 2002 called the Concert for George. It was held at the Royal Albert Hall in London. Eric performed George's songs with an all-star lineup. During the performance, Eric broke down several times. In a 2011 interview, Eric said playing George's music was the hardest thing he ever did. Every note reminded him of what he lost: the friend, the brother, the man who saved him. Patty Boyd attended the concert. She and Eric had both moved on with their lives. She had remarried. Eric had children. They were friendly but distant. After the show, Patty and Eric talked briefly. She said in her book that they both acknowledged the strange, twisted path their lives had taken. They both loved George. They both hurt him. They both lost him. That shared grief connected them in a way nothing else could. The guilt that never goes away. In the years since George Harrison's death, Eric Clapton has spoken more openly about the guilt he carries. In a 2007 autobiography, Eric admitted that not a day goes by when he does not think about what he did to George. He said the betrayal haunts him. Even with George's forgiveness, Eric cannot forgive himself. He said that is his burden to carry for the rest of his life. Eric revealed in a 2013 interview with The Telegraph that he regrets the affair with Patty. Not because he did not love her, but because she was not worth losing George. Eric said Patty was a fantasy, a projection of what he wanted. George was real. George was solid. George was the one person who truly understood him. Eric said he traded something priceless for something temporary, and he will regret that forever. Eric also admitted that Layla, the song that made him famous, is now painful to perform. In a 2018 interview, Eric said every time he sings Layla, he thinks about George. He thinks about the pain he caused, the friendship he damaged. Eric said the song is beautiful, but it represents the worst decision of his life. He wishes he could take it back, wishes he had been strong enough to walk away from Patty and protect his friendship with George. In recent interviews, Eric has talked about the dreams he has of George. He said George appears to him sometimes. In the dreams, they are young again, playing guitars in George's living room, laughing, happy. Eric said those dreams feel like visits, like George is checking in, making sure Eric is okay. Eric wakes up from those dreams with tears on his face, grateful for the memory, devastated by the loss. At 80 ERIC, Clapton braks his silence. Now in 2024, at 80 years old, Eric Clapton is looking back on his life with brutal honesty. In recent interviews, he has made confessions about George Harrison that he has never spoken about publicly before. These revelations change how we understand their story. First, Eric confirms that betraying George was the biggest mistake of his life. In a 2023 interview with Uncut magazine, Eric said if he could go back and change one thing, it would be the affair with Patty. He said he would have walked away, told George about his feelings, and then removed himself from the situation. He said his weakness destroyed the most important friendship of his life. Second, Eric confirms that George Harrison was a better man than he will ever be. Eric said in a recent podcast that George's capacity for forgiveness was superhuman. Eric said he could never forgive someone who did to him what he did to George, but George did it without hesitation. Eric said that level of spiritual maturity is something he has spent his whole life trying to understand and has failed. Third, Eric reveals something shocking. He said in a 2024 interview that he believes George saved his life multiple times, not just by forgiving him, but by teaching him about love, real love, not the selfish, obsessive love Eric felt for Patty, but the unconditional, selfless love that George showed Eric even after the betrayal. Eric said learning that kind of love from George is the only reason he survived his addiction and depression. Fourth, Eric reveals his deepest regret. He said he wishes he had told George more often how much he meant to him. Eric said British men of their generation did not talk about feelings, but Eric wishes he had. He wishes he had told George, "You are my best friend, and I am sorry and I love you." Eric said he did say those things at the end, but he wishes he had said them every day for 30 years. Most importantly, Eric reveals what George taught him. Eric said in a recent interview that George showed him that forgiveness is the highest form of love. George could have hated Eric forever, could have cut him out completely, but George chose love, chose compassion, chose to rebuild what was broken. Eric said that choice changed his life, made him want to be a better person, made him believe in redemption. Where Clapton is now. Today at 80, Eric Clapton still performs. He tours occasionally, playing sold-out shows around the world. He still plays Layla, still feels the weight of its history every time. But now he dedicates it to George. He tells audiences the story, the love, the betrayal, the forgiveness. He wants people to know who George Harrison was, a man of extraordinary grace. Eric says now that every good thing in his life came from George in some way. George forgave him, which allowed Eric to forgive himself. That self-forgiveness led to sobriety. Sobriety led to stability. Stability led to family and peace. Eric said George set him on the path to healing. George saved him, and Eric will spend the rest of his life honoring that gift. Eric also says he talks to George, not literally, but in his mind. When Eric faces a difficult decision, he asks himself, what would George do? When Eric feels anger or resentment, he remembers George's forgiveness. When Eric feels lost, he remembers George's wisdom. In that way, George is still with him, still guiding him, still loving him. When asked what he wants people to know about George Harrison, Eric always says the same thing. George was a saint walking among us. He was flawed like everyone, but he had a light inside him, a capacity for love and forgiveness that most people never achieve. Eric said the world lost something precious when George died, but the example he set lives on in everyone who knew him. What Eric Clapton finally reveals at 80 is a truth that cuts to the heart of what it means to be human. We are all capable of terrible betrayals. We are all capable of hurting the people we love most, but we are also capable of forgiveness, of redemption, of love that survives the worst we can do to each other. Eric and George's story is not a simple tale of good versus evil. Eric is not a villain. George is not a saint. They were two men who loved each other deeply. Eric made a catastrophic mistake driven by loneliness and desire. George responded with a forgiveness driven by spirituality and love. Both men were changed forever by what happened. The lesson Eric wants people to take from his story is this: forgiveness is possible. Redemption is real, but you have to do the work. You have to face what you did, own it, carry the weight of it, and then you have to let love in. The love of the person you wronged, the love of friends and family, the love you give yourself. That is the path George showed Eric, and Eric has walked it for the last 23 years. At 80, Eric Clapton carries two things: the guilt of his betrayal and the gratitude for George's forgiveness. Both are heavy. Both are necessary. Together, they have made Eric who he is. A man who knows the cost of his mistakes. A man who knows the power of grace. A man who lost his best friend but carries him in his heart every single day. That is the truth Eric finally breaks his silence to tell, and it is painful and beautiful and achingly real.